Hi, my name is Christal Presley, and I'm the founder of the Intergenerational PTSD Project and United Children of Veterans. And I wanted to tell my story to you because it just didn't feel right asking other people to contribute to this website without telling my story as well. I should say that I'm not an expert at all on intergenerational PTSD. I had never even heard about it until a few years ago. I'm an English teacher. I have nothing to do with the medical profession, so please keep that in mind as you're listening. My experiences with intergenerational PTSD actually started a long time ago when I was 5 years old. I'm 32 now. Although I had no clue really, like I said, about intergenerational PTSD until a few years ago. And I had no idea that the symptoms that I was experiencing, I hadn't put two and two together that those were also my father's symptoms. So my dad was drafted to Vietnam before I was born. He was 18 years old. And when he came back, according to his family, like so many young men of that era, he was totally different. My father was always an outdoorsy kind of kid. They told all these cool stories about him, about how he would throw rocks into the creek and try to make snakes slither ashore. He had a pet pigeon named Jojo. He would walk in the woods all the time and go inside caverns. And I always really liked those kinds of stories. And when my father came back from Vietnam, apparently he went berserk. When I was 5 years old, I remember my father coming home from work and his hands were shaking so badly that he couldn't untie his shoes. And from that moment forward, I don't really have many memories before that, but I do remember that from that moment forward, everything in my family life was different. My mother and I, from that moment forward, began to walk on eggshells. My father would gravitate between fits of depression, anxiety, and rage, and I was really scared of him, petrified actually, until I left the house when I was 18 years old and went to college, and even scared thereafter because his behavior was so erratic. One of the things that I remember also very vividly is that during his fits of depression and then rage, he would often take his gun to the river. And this was code when he would slam the door behind him with his gun in hand and he would get into his truck and drive away. This going to the river was code for killing himself. And my mother and I never knew if he would actually come back or not. And this caused, so many things caused a big strain in my family life at that time, but this caused, I think, the biggest strain, one of the biggest strains of all. My father would get so depressed that he would hide in his room for weeks at a time. He wasn't really able to participate that much in opening Christmas presents, family outings, birthday parties. It was all a big strain for him. I think that he found kids in general, and particularly me, very loud, very unpredictable, as kids are. And so my father was so sound sensitive that even dropping a glass of water, a balloon popping, you just never knew when something like that happened, when a sound actually came, what my father would do. It was like there was this switch in him, and when a sound actually occurred, when I dropped a glass of water, he would just go berserk all over again. And so I spent a big part of my childhood hiding in my room from him, and he would hide from me, or I think most of the time, and my mother as well. So I also remember these sweat pads coming in the mail all the time when I was younger, and the VA would send them in big boxes. They would also send just bags and bags of pills. It seemed like they were coming every week, but I know that they probably weren't coming that much. So my mother and I would open these boxes of sweat pads, and I never really knew what they were for back then. It was only when I was probably a teenager that I really was able to put two and two together, but my father was having these horrible nightmares about Vietnam. And so the pads were to actually catch the sweat at night from his nightmares. And it wasn't very long after that, I would say when I was a young teenager, when I started having nightmares of my own about Vietnam and about my father being in Vietnam although of course I had never been in war, really didn't know anything about the war. And I would start to ask questions about the war. Mom, tell me about Vietnam. Why is my dad like he is? And my mom would say, she would whisper the word Vietnam. She would say, we don't talk about Vietnam. Or if I asked, what's wrong with Dad, she would say, it's Vietnam. And she would whisper it. So that word in my family became so taboo. And I'm not even sure I really knew Vietnam was a war until probably a young teenager. I always thought when I was a kid that my dad had this horrible disease, this sickness called Vietnam, and that nobody else had it but me, or that nobody else had it but him and my family. I think my dad tried really, really hard to be a good father. I definitely want to say that. But things were difficult for him. It was not a matter as simple as, hey, let's take the family and go to the store. There were so many things to think about, like how much traffic was going to be on the road and what kind of sounds were there going to be. Would there be a truck backfiring when he was driving? And then what would happen when a truck backfired? When we got to the store, would his mood be able to be stable for 30 minutes, for an hour, until we could get groceries or do whatever we needed to do? And so my mother and I, of course, we weren't focused on getting groceries or having a good time. We were always focused on how was my dad feeling, and we were always looking around for exit signs, always looking around to make sure that we could try to stabilize the environment for him as much as possible. And I never realized until later on that this hypersensitivity that my mother and I both developed in order to protect my father actually mirrored my father's hypersensitivity. As time went by, my grades dropped drastically. I was definitely depressed, although in middle school and high school, I wasn't cognizant that I was really experiencing what was probably true depression. I didn't realize that until later on when I went to college and began to seek therapy. I remember playing softball, particularly during my senior year of high school, and by that point I was so sound sensitive, just like my father, that I couldn't stand people yelling. I couldn't stand the bats clinking, and I made it through the softball season. I'm not sure how, but I know that everyone noticed that I was just odd. I'd always been an odd child, but I was definitely really odd during that time period. When I was 18, I left that little town and my parents' house as soon as I could. I thought that when I went to college, that leaving that household and being away from my father, that I could finally experience a normal kind of life and not have to be hypersensitive all the time, and not having to look around me all the time, not having to be afraid all the time, and not having to be that I wouldn't have to be so consumed with another person's well-being. And I felt very guilty about that, but at the same time, I just wanted to live my life and finally be happy. But something that surprised me is that when I went to college, it was almost as if I didn't know how to be among normal people. Not that anyone's normal, but I didn't know how to live in a normal society where people actually asked, how are you doing today? And they told people about their lives, because I had never done that. When people had asked me, how are you doing? How was your weekend? You didn't tell what was going on in my house. There's no way I would have told about my father hiding in his room, about taking his gun to the river. So I would always say, well, everything's fine. Well, once I began to have more normal weekends, more normal day-to-day life, it was almost as if I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know how to live and not be hypersensitive all the time. So that caused great anxiety. And then it was as if I was still hypersensitive all over again. And it was like I couldn't cut that switch off. And even today, it's like I still at times can't cut that switch off. I'm always looking for exit signs. I'm always waiting for some sort of sound to happen. Even when I go to parties and things, sometimes I feel very, very alone, almost as if everybody else is talking and having a good time. And yeah, I might be having a good time, but because of the things that I've experienced, I think I'm much more aware of my surroundings and much more worried about the what ifs that could happen in day-to-day life. But when I was in college, I became so depressed and so anxiety-ridden that I didn't go to class. And in fact, I would purposefully sign up for these huge classes in auditoriums where 600 or 700 people would attend, so nobody would ever know if I was there or not. And I spent most of my time in bed, lying on the floor, so almost sedated with various medications that I was on for anxiety, depression. So one of the things that I did during college was actually began to see psychiatrists and began to see therapists. And I think that ever so slowly that did help. But I think that in a way, I was on so much medication that I was numb, and it was really hard to even think about what was happening to me, because the only thing I could think about was that I just didn't feel anything. And another thing that I want to say about intergenerational PTSD is that I know it's a controversial topic, much the same way that PTSD was a controversial topic. It was called anything from soldier's heart to shell shock, and it was first actually placed in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health, in 1980. And I don't know enough about intergenerational PTSD to even advocate whether it should be in the DSM or not, but the purpose of this website and the purpose of me doing this interview today is to basically share experiences. I think that whether this ends up in the DSM or not, I think that it's important for me to tell about the things that happened to me when I was growing up. And it's important for people to get together and share those experiences. Everybody has different experiences with intergenerational PTSD. And just because a soldier comes back from war and has PTSD, I don't think that's any guarantee at all that the family is going to end up with PTSD, that trauma is necessarily always going to be passed from generation to generation. But I think that in my case, it definitely was. And I've struggled with the same rage, depression, anxiety, hiding, feeling completely alone that my father struggled with. And the only thing that I can think of that this could have come from is Vietnam, because it was because of Vietnam that my father got PTSD and exhibited the symptoms that he did. And whether that changed something genetically for him and perhaps was passed to me, or whether I became just a complete product of my environment and learned to cope with things the way my father coped, in the end, the result is the same. I'm doing much, much better these days, but I still really, really struggle from time to time with the same depression, the same anxiety, and I hope that one day it will go away entirely, and maybe it will, maybe it won't. But the important thing is that it's been through this project and through United Children of Veterans that I've been able to finally use these things, these experiences, as tools to bring other people together and hopefully help other people heal through the sharing of stories. Thank you so much.